The kingdom was trembling with tension, the aging King David lying on his bed, frail and fading, as the question of succession stirred ambition and fear across Jerusalem. In the shadows of the palace, Adonijah had already crowned himself king, but God had a different plan. Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba moved quickly, and with David's blessing, Solomon was declared king. Trumpets sounded, the people rejoiced, and the young Solomon, still untested, was now the ruler of Israel, stepping into a throne built on blood, prophecy, and divine promise. He was not the eldest, nor the strongest, but he was the chosen. From the beginning, Solomon understood the weight of leadership, and in one of his earliest acts, he went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, not a few, but 1,000 burnt offerings, a display of reverence and desperation for divine favor. That night, under the stillness of the heavens, God appeared to Solomon in a dream. "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." And unlike a warrior or a tyrant, Solomon did not ask for wealth or power or the death of his enemies. He asked for wisdom, a discerning heart to govern well. This pleased the Lord, and in response God gave him not only what he asked for, but what he didn't: riches, honor, and long life, if only he would walk in God's ways. From that moment on, the legend of Solomon began to unfold like a golden scroll. He judged with unparalleled discernment, as in the famous case of the 2 women and the 1 living child. His wisdom spread like wildfire beyond the borders of Israel, whispered in courts and marketplaces from Egypt to Mesopotamia. Kings and queens sent envoys to marvel at the intellect of a man who could speak of cedar trees and hyssop, of animals and birds, of justice and governance. Under his rule, Israel thrived. Silver was as common as stones in Jerusalem. He built ships, traded with distant lands, and brought wealth flowing into the kingdom. But no project defined his reign more than the temple. David had longed to build it, but the task fell to Solomon. 7 years of construction, with tens of thousands of laborers, skilled artisans, and imported cedar from Lebanon. When the temple of the Lord was finally complete, it was breathtaking, a dwelling for the Almighty more glorious than anything the earth had seen. On the day of dedication, Solomon stood before the altar, lifted his hands to heaven, and prayed, a prayer that would echo through the generations, invoking God's presence, mercy, and justice. The fire of heaven fell. The glory of the Lord filled the temple, and the people bowed their faces to the ground in awe. Peace settled over the land like dew. Solomon's fame reached its pinnacle. Every year, tributes poured in. Rulers visited not just to admire his kingdom, but to sit at his feet and drink from the fountain of his wisdom. Chief among them was the Queen of Sheba. Her caravan arrived with gold, spices, and hard questions. And Solomon answered each one, leaving her breathless, not only with the depth of his insight but with the order of his court, the majesty of his palace, and the offerings at the temple. She praised the God of Israel, and returned home changed, her treasure given freely as tribute to the man who seemed to hold heaven's wisdom in mortal hands. And yet, as the years passed and the gold multiplied, something began to shift. Solomon's heart, once wholly devoted, began to explore new paths. Not openly, not rebelliously at first, but subtly. He married daughters of foreign kings to seal alliances, bringing Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites into his royal household. One wife became 2, then 10, then 100, then 1,000. With them came foreign gods, foreign altars, and strange rituals. And Solomon, once the builder of God's temple, began to build shrines for Moloch, Ashtoreth, and Chemosh. The man who had once prayed for discernment now began to compromise under the weight of affection and political calculation. But in those early years, those golden years, Solomon was the model of divine blessing. His proverbs, thousands in number, were filled with truth. His songs, like the Song of Songs, burned with poetic beauty. He wrote of life and death, of seasons and toil, of the vanity of chasing the wind. Wisdom was his mantle, power was his tool, and peace was his legacy. The world looked upon him and saw what it meant to be favored by God. But even then, The seeds of ruin had been planted, hidden in the soil of success. For all his wisdom, Solomon would learn that knowledge does not guarantee obedience, and that the heart is not ruled by insight alone. His journey was not over. It was only beginning, and the higher he rose, the further he would have to fall. In the corridors of his palace, where golden shields adorned the walls and singers echoed through marble halls, the whispers of idolatry had already begun to echo louder than the voice of the Lord. At the height of Solomon's reign, there was no king on earth who matched his glory. His palaces gleamed with imported marble. His court shimmered with garments dyed in Tyrian purple. The people of Israel dwelled in safety, each man under his vine and fig tree, and Jerusalem pulsed with culture, music, and reverence. Yet beneath the harmony of public triumph, a silent corrosion had begun. Solomon's pursuit of wisdom had given birth to understanding, but that understanding, untethered from devotion, had become license. His desire for political dominance led him to make alliances, and with those alliances came brides, foreign, noble, beautiful, and dangerous. Pharaoh's daughter was just the beginning. She was gifted to Solomon not as a woman but as a symbol of power. He built her a house, separate from the temple, to preserve its holiness. But the division would prove prophetic. He no longer viewed intimacy as covenant but as diplomacy, and with each new marriage the boundaries of worship began to blur. The Torah had warned Israel's kings not to multiply wives, nor to amass great wealth, nor to rely on chariots and horses from Egypt. Solomon did all three. His wisdom remained sharp, but his will softened. As years passed, he began to entertain the gods of his wives, not out of conviction but curiosity, and then convenience. At first he permitted them to build shrines outside Jerusalem. Then he joined them. He did not renounce the God of Israel. He merely added others beside him. The one who had appeared to him in dreams, who had filled the temple with fire, was now crowded out by a pantheon of idols. Solomon's love for God, once singular and fervent, had become fragmented. His heart was divided, and in that division corruption grew. He wrote Ecclesiastes like a man searching through smoke, speaking of vanity, weariness, and futility. Gold no longer satisfied, women no longer thrilled, wisdom no longer comforted. Everything under the sun seemed meaningless because the sun above had been forgotten. Even as Solomon continued to govern with brilliance, building cities, organizing trade, and fortifying borders, his internal compass had shifted. He taxed the people heavily to sustain his lavish lifestyle and expansive building projects. What had started as God-given dominion began to look like oppression. The house of Joseph murmured under the weight of forced labor. 10 tribes began to grumble in secret. The king who had once asked for a listening heart now turned a deaf ear to the cry of the people. He surrounded himself with flatterers, married women whose hearts were far from Yahweh, and established cultic altars on hills near the city of peace. He had become everything he had once feared, not in rebellion, but in distraction, not in hatred, but in delusion. He still spoke of the Lord in public gatherings, still sang psalms at feast days, but his private life whispered a different story, one where devotion had been replaced by desire and worship by wealth. God, who sees not as man sees, looked upon Solomon's heart and was grieved. The covenant had not changed. The promise made to David still stood. Obedience would bring blessing, but idolatry would bring judgment. Twice the Lord had appeared to Solomon, not in silence but with glory, and still Solomon turned away. It was not ignorance, but defiance, wrapped in comfort. And so the word of the Lord came. The kingdom would be torn from his son. Not in Solomon's lifetime, for the sake of David, but soon enough. The throne would fracture, peace would be shattered, enemies would rise, and all the splendor Solomon had built would become a monument to a divided heart. But even then, God did not strike him down. He let the consequences unfold slowly, like smoke rising from an altar no longer pure. Solomon began to sense it, first in whispers, then in open conflict. Hadad the Edomite returned from Egypt, burning with vengeance. Rezon of Zobah rose up, in Damascus sowing unrest, and most notably Jeroboam, an ambitious servant of Solomon, caught the eye of the prophet Ahijah. In a symbolic act, Ahijah tore a cloak into 12 pieces and handed 10 to Jeroboam, declaring that God would give him rule over 10 tribes. Solomon, realizing the threat, sought to kill Jeroboam, who fled to Egypt. The kingdom was beginning to unravel, and Solomon knew it. Yet he did not repent. He continued to build, to rule, to write. But his words were heavier, his eyes wearier. The songs grew darker, the reflections deeper. In Ecclesiastes, he wrote not as a king, but as a man haunted by what he had become. He spoke of pleasures tried and found wanting, gardens planted, houses built, slaves acquired, singers employed. He pursued laughter and folly, and still, joy eluded him. His wisdom remained, but it was now a mirror that reflected his emptiness. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired, he confessed, yet everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. And beneath those poetic laments was a deeper truth. Solomon had tasted everything the world could offer and found it dust. The man who once asked for wisdom had become a fool by degrees, not through ignorance but indulgence. The kingdom still stood, the temple still glittered, but the foundation was cracking. The tragedy of Solomon was not that he fell suddenly, but that he drifted slowly, exchanging intimacy with God for intimacy with the world. And yet, even in his fading years, some embers of insight remained. He urged the reader of Ecclesiastes to remember your Creator in the days of your youth before the days of trouble come. It was advice he had failed to heed. The man who once stood radiant before the altar now wandered the echoing halls of his palace, searching for the peace that had once been his. His riches could not buy it. His wives could not offer it. His knowledge could not manufacture it. Solomon had become the embodiment of paradox, wise but wandering, blessed but broken, king of peace, yet tormented within. The drift had not destroyed his throne, but it had hollowed his soul, and with each passing day the shadow of division lengthened over Israel. Solomon's palace still shimmered in the sun, and incense still rose from the Temple Mount, but the air in Jerusalem had changed. What once felt like divine order had grown into something colder, grander, yes, more majestic, but hollow. The people sensed it. Behind the display of prosperity, burdens were growing heavier. Forced labor expanded. Taxes became oppressive. The machinery of empire ground on, powered not by joy but by demand. Solomon's administrative genius, once praised as wise governance, had hardened into bureaucracy. The walls were still strong, the cities fortified, but a different kind of decay had begun, the kind that starts in the soul of a nation, when leaders forget their first love, and people follow ritual instead of presence. The covenant had not vanished, but it had been diluted. The God who once filled the temple with fire now seemed distant, grieved by the very hands that had built his house and later built altars to foreign gods. Solomon, now older and heavier, with years, found his days filled with ceremonial obligations and political entanglements. He held audiences with dignitaries, conducted sacrifices, reviewed shipments of gold from Ophir, signed edicts, yet his heart remained restless. At night, alone in his chambers, he no longer dreamed of divine visits. The silence of heaven weighed on him. His mind, sharp as ever, churned with reflections that had grown darker. He wrote of life and toil, of the pointlessness of striving, of men who rise only to fall, of wisdom overtaken by folly. His words were not those of a man rebelling against God, but of one trying to remember what it meant to walk with him. His soul had tasted too much of the world to be innocent, and too much of the divine to be satisfied with anything less. It was in this tension that his writings took on their haunted tone, as if every proverb and reflection were a mirror held to his own decline. The kingdom, though still unified, had begun to strain. Tribal loyalties that once bowed before Solomon's charisma now simmered with old resentments. The northern tribes, particularly Ephraim and Manasseh, grew weary of royal edicts passed down from a distant and increasingly out-of-touch court. Jeroboam, once a mere servant, had become a symbol of discontent. His leadership over the forced labor of Joseph's house gave him both visibility and influence. When the prophet Ahijah confronted him, tearing a cloak into 12 pieces and declaring 10 would become his, Jeroboam did not rejoice, he fled. Even he knew that the favor of God on a divided nation meant judgment on its king. But Solomon, instead of falling on his face in repentance as his father David once had, reacted in fear and self-preservation. He sought to kill Jeroboam, a man whose only crime had been chosen by God. Enemies rose from outside as well. Hadad the Edomite, once a child hiding in Egypt, returned with vengeance in his heart. Rezin of Zobah harassed the northern borders, sowing unrest in Damascus. These adversaries were not merely political thorns, they were divine instruments. God had stirred them, not out of hatred for Solomon, but as warnings, like rumblings before an earthquake. Their presence spoke of a deeper judgment brewing, but the king remained unmoved. He continued to build, to write, to preside. He poured out proverbs and administrative reforms with the same skill as before, but without the fire of the early days. The temple still operated. The rituals continued. But the intimacy was gone. The Ark of the Covenant remained in the Holy of Holies, but the covenant itself had been betrayed in the secret chambers of Solomon's heart. And yet, he did not crumble all at once. His life was not marked by a single fall, but by 1,000 compromises. It was not a cliff he walked off, but a gentle slope down which he wandered for years. Each foreign wife, each shrine built on a hilltop, each sacrifice to an idol, these were steps, small at first, justified, strategic, harmless it seemed, but they accumulated. And the Solomon who had once asked for a discerning heart to govern well had become numb to the God who had granted it. Wisdom without obedience had become a curse. Knowledge of good and evil without surrender had twisted into disillusionment. He saw too much, understood too deeply, and felt too little. The burden of knowing what was right, yet lacking the will to choose it, became a crown of thorns he placed on his own head. His writings in Ecclesiastes became less like teachings and more like confessions. What does man gain from all his labor? There is nothing new under the sun. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. But these were not the words of a man at peace. They were echoes of someone trying to remember what it meant to fear God, trying to recover reverence beneath the weight of regret. Solomon stood at the edge of his life like a man who had seen everything, and now wondered if it had all been worth it. The laughter of his courts rang hollow. The perfume of his wives reminded him more of the gods they served than the covenant he had broken. His gold no longer glittered with joy. His palaces felt like prisons. And all the songs once sung in praise of Yahweh were drowned by the noise of altars to Baal and Ashtoreth. Israel remained united in name, but its soul had begun to fracture. The hearts of the people followed their king's example, not in rebellion, but in apathy. The greatest tragedy was not that Solomon sinned, it was that he forgot. He forgot the God who had chosen him, the dream in Gibeon, the fire on the altar, the day the glory filled the temple. He forgot that wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord, not with the admiration of nations. And as he drifted further into the twilight of his years, the very gifts God had given him became the instruments of his sorrow. The throne stood tall, the kingdom remained, but in the throne room of heaven judgment had already been declared, not in wrath, but in sorrow, not in fire, but in silence. Solomon's crown still rested upon his head, the gold untarnished, the jewels still brilliant. But beneath the weight of that crown was a man increasingly aware that time does not forgive compromises, and God does not ignore betrayal. The laughter of the courts continued, the wine flowed, the music played, but it all felt like a stage set for a story whose climax had already been written. The king's gaze was distant now, drawn more to the horizon than to the throne. He would walk the cedar-lined corridors of his palace and remember the fire that once fell from heaven, the hush of a people overcome by glory, the moment he stood before the altar and dedicated a temple that bore God's name. He remembered it all, and the memory burned, not because it had been taken from him, but because he had given it away piece by piece, one choice at a time. The shrines stood quiet on the hills, but their presence spoke volumes. Ashtoreth, Moloch, Chemosh, names that had no place in Israel, now had altars built by the hand of the wisest man on earth. It wasn't that Solomon had turned his back on Yahweh completely. He still offered sacrifices at the temple, still participated in festivals, still wore the robes of a devout king. But his heart was split. He had learned to live with contradiction, to speak the language of covenant by day and indulge the rituals of foreign gods by night. His palace became a museum of compromise, each wing housing another alliance, another foreign bride, another altar built to appease, to pacify, to avoid conflict. Peace in the kingdom had come at the cost of peace in his soul. The man who had once prayed for wisdom above all else had allowed pleasure and politics to twist that gift into self-deception. And the Lord, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, gave space for repentance. But Solomon did not take it, not when Jeroboam rose in influence, not when the prophet Ahijah pronounced the coming division, not when enemies began to chip at the borders. Each warning was met with more effort to preserve the illusion of control, more building, more alliances, more wealth. But the center could not hold. God spoke again, not in fire this time, not in dreams, but in judgment. Because you have done this and have not kept my covenant and my statutes, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. Yet even then mercy was present. Nevertheless, I will not do it during your lifetime, for the sake of your father David. It would be Solomon's son who would feel the full weight of the fracture. And this too became a sorrow too deep for Solomon to ignore. He began to write again, not commands or celebrations, but reflections. Ecclesiastes became his confession booth, each verse a whispered regret. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. These were not the words of a cynic, but of a man who had touched everything: wisdom, wealth, wine, women, and still felt the emptiness of a soul estranged from its creator. He had built gardens and parks, reservoirs and palaces, but found no lasting joy in them. He had surrounded himself with singers, entertainers, artisans, and scholars, but still felt alone. He had written thousands of proverbs and yet failed to live by the fear of the Lord, the beginning of the very wisdom he possessed. The glory that once burned so brightly in his youth now flickered like a dying flame, and Solomon was left staring into the ash of his own decisions. And yet, he did not run. He did not rage. He endured. The weight of his failure was not met with denial, but with bitter reflection. He saw the end from the beginning now, and that perspective, though painful, was true wisdom. He had seen what it was to be king over a people blessed by God, and he had seen what it was to live with the silence of heaven. He had tasted the sweetness of divine favor and the bitterness of divine displeasure. And in his final writings, he returned again and again to the same conclusion: fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. There, in those simple words, was the clarity he had lost. Not in palaces, not in wealth, not in the arms of women or the applause of nations, but in the quiet obedience of the heart. The people still called him king. The nations still brought tribute. But Solomon had changed. His robes no longer felt like glory. His crown no longer sat as light as it once had. He was not angry. He was not proud. He was tired. And in his tiredness, he was honest. There are sorrows only those who have tasted everything can understand. And Solomon carried those sorrows like shadows that never left his side. He no longer searched for new pleasures. He no longer chased admiration. He no longer believed that wisdom alone could save him. He had learned that the gift without the giver becomes a curse, that knowledge without reverence becomes vanity, and that peace without purity is only the silence before the storm. The kingdom was still whole, for now. The throne still stood. But the cracks were there, deep and unseen, and Solomon, seated on that throne, knew it would not last. He looked at his son Rehoboam, bold but untested, and feared for what would come. Not because of politics, but because of legacy. The choices of the father would echo in the reign of the son. And Solomon, wise as he was, had written a story his heir would struggle to escape. He had been blessed with more than any man before him, and he had squandered it, not in malice, but in distraction, not in defiance, but in drift. The tragedy of Solomon was not that he fell violently, but that he fell quietly, slowly, inevitably. The throne of Solomon still towered over Israel, ivory inlaid with gold, lions carved at its steps, a symbol of strength and splendor unmatched by any other king on earth. But no matter how grand the throne, it could not hide the truth. The legacy it carried was cracked. Beneath the robes of power and the architecture of empire, a storm had long been brewing. Solomon, now aged and worn, had built everything a man could desire: temples, cities, armies, wealth beyond imagination. He had spoken with God, been filled with divine wisdom, witnessed miracles, and governed during decades of peace. But none of it was enough to silence the consequence of compromise. His kingdom, once a vessel of glory, had become a stage of slow unraveling. And though the palace walls still stood firm, the foundations of the nation trembled under the weight of unrepented idolatry and spiritual negligence. The people of Israel had grown used to Solomon's grandeur. His judgments still echoed with authority. His writings were revered and his ceremonies were majestic. Yet among the tribes, especially in the north, murmurs began to rise. The burden of taxation had intensified. Forced labor, once accepted for the temple's glory, now served the vanity of palaces and gardens for foreign wives. Loyalty to the house of David weakened. Reverence gave way to resentment. The elders who once praised the king's discernment now questioned his policies. The songs of celebration became whispers of weariness. For years, Solomon ruled through structure and strength, but love for his leadership had faded. The people could no longer see the man who once humbly prayed for wisdom. They saw only a monarch entangled in indulgence and alliances that diluted their nation's soul. Among those whispers, one name grew louder: Jeroboam. A man of skill and leadership, placed by Solomon over the labor force of Joseph's tribes. He was not royalty, he was not chosen by bloodline, yet God, who lifts up the humble and brings low the proud, sent the prophet Ahijah to him. In a field outside the city, Ahijah met Jeroboam with a dramatic act, tearing a cloak into 12 pieces and giving him 10. "This is what the Lord says," he declared, "I will tear the kingdom from Solomon and give you 10 tribes." It was not a political revolt. It was divine consequence. Solomon's heart had turned from the Lord. The kingdom would follow. God's judgment was not impulsive. It was measured, delayed out of loyalty to David, but inevitable nonetheless. And Jeroboam, stunned by the weight of prophecy, fled to Egypt. Solomon, instead of falling in repentance, sought to silence the threat. Even in his decline, he preferred control to surrender. But it was not only Jeroboam who stirred the winds of division. Foreign adversaries, once subdued by Solomon's diplomacy, sensed weakness. Rezon of Damascus and Hadad of Edom harassed Israel's borders. These weren't merely enemies, they were mirrors of Solomon's lost protection. When he walked in covenant, the nations feared him. Now they challenged him. Peace, once a gift from God, had become a fragile illusion maintained by gold and treaties. The decline of divine favor made itself known not in fire or plague, but in erosion, in the slow unraveling of unity, the cooling of loyalty, and the loss of spiritual clarity. Solomon watched it all with eyes that once saw visions of glory. Now they saw decline. And in that decline, he understood what many great men never do: that the height of success means nothing if the foundation is compromised. In the quiet chambers of his palace, surrounded by scrolls and memories, Solomon took up his pen again, not to record triumphs but to confess. Ecclesiastes was not written from the throne, it was written from the ashes of understanding. He who had everything came to this. Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. These words were not despair. They were revelation. He had tasted every pleasure, gathered every treasure, and found that without the fear of God, all was vanity. He saw the end of every road he had walked. He saw the sons of the poor labor to build his wonders, saw the fire of worship replaced by ritual, and heard in his heart the silence of a God who had once spoken directly to him. It was not punishment that haunted Solomon. It was memory. He remembered being chosen. He remembered asking for wisdom. And now he remembered how far he had strayed. The temple still stood, golden and sacred, the center of worship in Israel. But its fire no longer fell. The presence had not departed visibly, but the intimacy was gone. The priests still served, the sacrifices still burned, but the God of covenant was grieved. He had not abandoned Israel, but his favor had been withdrawn from its king. And Solomon, for all his wisdom, could not rebuild what his choices had torn. The legacy he had hoped to leave, one of peace, unity, and reverence, was fractured. His son Rehoboam lacked his father's discernment, and though he would inherit the crown, he would not inherit the kingdom in its fullness. Solomon had seen the vision. He had seen the fire. But he had also seen the cost of forgetting that every gift from God must be stewarded with humility, not consumed by pride. The final days of Solomon's reign were not marked by revolution, but by reflection. His palace remained, his wealth unmatched, but his soul bore the scars of decisions made in comfort rather than conviction. He stood as a man who had reached the summit only to realize he had built his house on sand. And in his writings, he offered no excuses, only warnings. Warnings that knowledge without obedience is a snare, that success without surrender is hollow, that the heart, if divided, will always drift from its source. Fear God and keep his commandments, he wrote, for this is the whole duty of man. There in those words was the echo of his youth, the voice that once prayed with trembling, "Give your servant an understanding heart." But that prayer had long since faded into the corridors of history, and though Solomon still sat on the throne, his kingdom had already begun to split, not just territorially, but spiritually. His legacy was no longer secure, his wisdom no longer protected him. The man who had once been a light to the nations now stood as a warning to all who believe that intellect can substitute for intimacy with God. He had been given more than any man before him. But in forgetting the source of his wisdom, he ensured that the very blessing he received would become the seed of his undoing. The corridors of Solomon's palace grew quieter with each passing day. The music still played, the ceremonies continued, but behind the regal facade, the man who once captured the awe of nations now stood face to face with the end. He had built towers to the sky, spoken with God, ruled over a united people, and tasted the sweetness of divine favor. But now, in his final years, those victories felt distant, like echoes from a former life. His hands, once lifted in prayer before a flame-filled altar, now trembled under the weight of a crown that no longer brought peace. His name still commanded respect, but not reverence. His wisdom was still quoted, but no longer followed. Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, had become a living paradox. A man who understood everything yet failed to guard the one thing that mattered most, his heart. Outside the palace walls, the people no longer felt the glory that once hovered over Jerusalem. They felt the burdens instead. Taxes had risen. Labor demands increased. The temple still stood, a marvel of the ancient world, but the God who once filled it with his presence now watched from a distance. Foreign gods had claimed the hills, strange rituals had crept into the land, and the covenant had been diluted by politics. Israel was still whole in geography, but fractured in soul. The elders remembered David's humble worship, his passion for the ark, his dances before the Lord. In contrast, Solomon's reign, though golden in wealth, had grown cold in spirit. The people had grown numb to grandeur. Their eyes no longer searched the horizon for signs of blessing. They waited for change, for reckoning, for what would come after. And what would come after was already taking shape. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, prepared for ascension. But his heart lacked the softness of his grandfather and the clarity of his father's early days. Surrounded by young advisors who mocked humility and prized domination, Rehoboam did not inherit the wisdom of Solomon, only his authority. The elders of Israel, weary of decades of heavy burdens, approached the new king with a plea: lighten the load, show mercy, and they would serve him forever. But Rehoboam, in his pride, rejected the voice of experience. He chose cruelty over compassion. "My father chastised you with whips," and he said, "I will chastise you with scorpions." And with those words, the kingdom cracked in two. 10 tribes broke away, forming the northern kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam. Only Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to the house of David. The division was not merely political, it was spiritual. The consequences of Solomon's choices had finally ripened. Solomon did not live to see the full fracture, but he felt it coming. In his last days, the signs were all around him. Loyal men became quiet. Prophets no longer visited his courts. The sense of divine presence, so thick in his youth, had been replaced by an unsettling stillness. God had not spoken to him in years, not through dreams, not through fire, not through voice. The silence was not cruel, it was deserved. Solomon had ignored warning after warning, built altar after altar to false gods, and traded the intimacy of the Most High for the applause of nations. He had not rebelled in fury, but in gradual compromise. And now, near the end, that compromise bore its final fruit, the knowledge that his legacy would be one of division. He had written proverbs to guide kings, but had not guided his own son. And so Solomon turned once more to writing, not as a teacher, not as a preacher, but as a mourner. Ecclesiastes became his final song, not of despair, but of truth. He stripped away every illusion, dismantled every false comfort. "Vanity of vanities," he wrote. "All is vanity." But within that confession lay wisdom purer than gold. Not wisdom gained in triumph, but wisdom refined in regret. He spoke of seasons, of toil, of injustice and time, of laughter and sorrow. He spoke of man's smallness and God's sovereignty. And he pointed finally beyond himself. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. In those words, Solomon reached not for his crown, but for his Creator. He could not undo the damage, he could not reunite the kingdom, but he could remember, and in remembering, he could leave behind a warning written in wisdom and tears. The day Solomon died, there were no great signs in the sky, no fire fell, no earthquakes shook the land. The king who had once dedicated the temple with 7 days of celebration passed quietly. The city mourned, the court wept, but in the silence, a deeper grief settled, a realization that the age of glory had ended not with a sword, but with a whisper. The golden reign had not collapsed in violence, but had decayed from within. Solomon's tomb was carved in splendor. His riches were buried with him. His songs, proverbs, and writings were preserved. But his soul had walked a path that warned, every generation after, wisdom is not enough. Gifts are not enough. Blessings are not enough. Without obedience, without fear of the Lord, even the greatest life can end in ashes. Yet even in his fall, God's mercy remained. The promise to David still held. From Solomon's line would come kings. From his blood would come redemption. A greater son would rise, not to build temples of stone, but to restore hearts of flesh. Jesus of Nazareth, centuries later, would stand among the people and say, "One greater than Solomon is here." He would offer what Solomon could not, perfect wisdom without sin, glory without pride, truth without compromise. And in that greater sun, the broken line of Solomon would find healing. The story of the fallen king would not be erased, but redeemed. His failures would serve as signposts, pointing to the need for a king who would never stray, whose heart would never be divided, whose throne would never fall. And so ends the story of Solomon, a man of brilliance, of beauty, of contradiction, the builder of Israel's greatest temple, the author of its deepest regrets. He stood at the height of blessing and fell beneath the weight of his own choices. But his voice still speaks, not in pride but in warning, in sorrow, in wisdom forged through fire. He reminds us that what begins in glory must be guarded with humility, that every gift demands stewardship, and that the fear of the Lord is not merely the beginning of wisdom, it is its only true foundation.